Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Watier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Watier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Doing fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We are going to be talking about fasting, if you can believe it. Really cool article out of September 2023 from the Journal of Nature Communications. We're going to go into gut microbiome remodeling and metabolomic profile improves in response to protein pacing with intermittent fasting versus continuous caloric restriction. Sounds like a party. Don't worry. As the intro just stated, we're going to leave you today with one or two actionable items that you can put into your day-to-day fasting lifestyle. Got a couple other articles that we're going to bring alongside of this one as adjuncts just to support a couple of the principles that we truly believe in when adopting a fasting lifestyle when it comes to fasting tendencies, consistency, macronutrients, and protein. So it's going to be a fun conversation, Tommy. I think it's going to make an impact for a lot of folks because it's going to really apply to anyone and everyone that's trying to adopt a fasting lifestyle. So if you are new to the Fasting for Life podcast, if you're like, who are these two guys talking to the microphone 270 episodes in? Well, head back to episode 1, give it a listen. You'll know more about how fasting has transformed our lives. Gives you a little insight into why we do what we do now with our challenges, our programs, our resources, our coaching, and why we continue to bring an episode to you week in and week out. We are on a mission to pull people out of the matrix and to empower you to know that you can lose the weight once and for all, that fasting is the vehicle to do it, and that you can adopt this lifestyle for long-term health and weight loss success. So, welcome into the new folks. If you are an OG, shout out to you. Thank you for continuing to listen in, continuing to download, subscribe, rate, and review. I want to give a shout out here to one of the most recent 5-star reviews, which is our favorite kind. This is to SIU J-Dog. And it says, your fasting podcast is excellent. My weight has always been pretty good, but a family member has dementia. Therefore, I'm eating better in only about 5 or 6 hours from lunch to dinner every day. Your podcast has lots of good fasting ideas that I'm trying. So
Awesome.
I love this one because it's not about weight loss, right? And interestingly enough, yes, we're going to talk about weight loss today with intermittent fasting versus caloric restriction, the eat less, move more. But we're going to talk a lot about gut health, and we by no means are gut health experts. But the takeaways from this article are really profound when it comes to overall health, and that's the angle or the nuance that we're going to be taking with it today, Tommy. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. The gut-brain connection is a big one, and that's one that is just starting to be uncovered and, pulling back the layers of what's going on there. And then when you look at one of the words that you just said a minute ago was metabolome, right? Which is this grouping of metabolic substrates and key molecules, and understanding what's going on with your own metabolic health, and it's coming from the gut microbiome and the biochemical processes that are happening right there that directly lead to what's going on not only within the stomach and the gastrointestinal system, but also within the brain too. So when we talk about things like dementia or like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, type 3 diabetes, all of these kind of things, it effectively starts in the gut. And with what we're bringing in as far as nutrition goes and what the overall state of health for the rest of our physiology is. So this is all interrelated. So I think that's a really great way to kind of start off the conversation.
Yeah, so let's look at the fasting hours in the study, and then we'll go into the different macronutrient breakdowns. Then we'll go into the takeaways and why we feel this matters. So on the fasting days, so we're going to be looking at intermittent fasting versus intermittent fasting with protein pacing. So this is something that we practice what we preach, and we typically recommend for folks that track their macronutrients or their calories still when they come to fasting. I used to track and weigh and do all of those things. Now, with fasting, I no longer have to do that as long as we say, let's prioritize protein. Protein doesn't happen by accident. We are under-proteined in this country. It's not something, unless you've prepped it, that's readily convenient outside of some meat sticks or some jerky, but then you're worried about, sugar and flavorings and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
So the reality is that we really need to prioritize protein. I saw this funny meme the other day. It was a woman who was like, all right, so I got to get up. I got to get water in before coffee. I got to make sure I'm taking my multivitamin. I got to go get morning sunlight. I got to do a 15-minute walk post-breakfast. I got to get protein in. And she just goes throughout this entire day, and it's like, well, I give up because there's just so many things that we're supposed to do for good health.
Boxes.
Yeah, too many check boxes. But protein was one of the first things. She's like, I get 140 grams of protein a day. My gosh, like, what am I going to do? So the reality is we really focus on building our plate with protein first. So, one chicken breast versus 2, one beef patty versus 2, one plant protein source versus 2, doubling up that serving. So we follow the mindset, and you can get this in the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss. It's the 20-page PDF that really outlines what it looks like to ramp up your fasting, gives you a little bit of the science behind why, and why we believe it's important to get the weight off once and for all. But these macronutrient breakdowns are really cool, Tommy, in that we typically say 40, 40, 20. So 40 protein, 40 fat, 20 carb. And we're going to talk about the second article here in terms of the effects of weight loss with low carb versus low fat versus moderate macronutrient breakdown. So this gut microbiome remodeling is really looking at intermittent fasting with a higher protein focus compared to what the standard American diet typically is. So that's the first distinction here, is that standard American diet macronutrients, if you have weight, in this case, you're in the overweight or obese category, carrying those extra 15, 20, 30, 40 pounds or greater, that caloric restriction plus standard macronutrient profile isn't going to get you very far for very long.
Yeah, sure. It's a good point. And like you said, protein doesn't happen by accident, but we do tend to see by default that we'll have probably twice the macronutrients coming from, or twice the calories rather, coming from carbohydrates in typical standard American diet fashion. And the trouble there is that it doesn't promote an environment in the gut microbiome or anywhere else in the physiology that's going to lead to better metabolic flexibility, which we're going to need if we're going to want to burn through those pounds of excess fat stored, especially the dangerous visceral fat. We're going to want those things pushing their way into fat burning, into lipolysis, and getting away from carbohydrate burning, the sugar metabolism that we tend to be in a default kind of way. Because as soon as we ingest a meal, we have a blood sugar spike, we have an insulin response, and when 50, 60+% of those nutrients that are coming in, or the calories that are coming in, are from carbohydrates, then that's the main thing that the body has to be prepared to actually metabolize. And then so that changes what the metabolome looks like, what the gut microbiome looks like, and then everything kind of cascades from there. Versus if we're changing that distribution, like it sounds relatively simple, where I just say, okay, well, cut those carbohydrates in half and get closer to that 40-40-20 split. Well, guess what happens? You have a little bit more protein that's coming in and a little bit more fats that are coming in. Now you change the whole distribution of that gut microbiome. That then leads to these amazing downstream effects as well.
Yeah, so the IFP regimen, compared to the caloric restriction intervention, it was 35% carb, 30% fat, 35% protein. So that 35% protein number we love. We would like to see that carb come down slightly in the beginning. and then increase that fat. But you've got wiggle room here. It doesn't have to be incredibly specific and perfect.
Yeah.
But when it's compared to a lot of the studies we've talked about where it's 50, 55, 60% carbohydrate intake, then you add in the, that 63% of our consumption, not from a macro standpoint, but from a processing standpoint, our ultra processed foods.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother level of stuff that can go and degrade the health of the gut, right? And ultimately long-term health. So the fasting specifically here were participants, and if you ever heard us talk about ADF, alternate day fasting, there's something called modified ADF, which is a lot of the research that actually is out there, but if you don't look at it, it's called just ADF or alternate day, where you do a small meal on your fasting days, either 350 to 550 calories. We say make it pretty much 90% protein if you're doing that. So the fasting days, participants were instructed to consume that small, we call it a little mini meal, protein-paced mini meal. And then the actual fasting hours, Tommy, were what again?
Yeah. So each week they would do basically 1 to 2 days of fasting. So hour-wise, it worked out to about 36 to 60 hours of kind of an extended fast each week. And but each day that they were fasting like that, they would still consume that 350 to 550 calories. So not like full fasting, but a modified fasting approach.
Yeah, not like this. Yeah, like
not a full burn day.
Yeah, not a full burn day, no food, just water. Old school Gin Stevens, clean fasting, just water, nothing else, kind of thing. Which, especially if you're falling off the wagon or trying to get more consistent, this can be really helpful to increase the consistency while still getting a lot of the benefits that we're going to share here in just a few minutes. So, this is a question we get often is like, well, how often what's an extended fast? How often do you extend it? Well, in our coaching, and during our challenges, we don't typically go past that 48-hour mark very often. And if you do, going to the 72-hour mark, the frequency of that is not all that frequent if you still want to get results while still maintaining a level of sanity and lifestyle where you can say yes to things on the weekends and have flexibility for life events and date nights and all that kind of stuff. So
what about food choices? What about food choices as well? It can become that you don't have very many opportunities.
It's not too restrictive.
Food choices, right? But if you're going down the path of many frequent extended fasts, you also are abstaining from making good food choices. You don't have the opportunities, so you're not getting the reps also, which can mean even though you might see some changes on the scale, those changes can end up being big fluctuations, or weight comes back unexpectedly, which is not what you were hoping for because you didn't have the reps making the food choices later on. So we need to be getting those food choice reps as well.
Yeah, so the second article, I want to bring it up now, and then we'll go through all of the benefits that the intermittent fasting with protein compared to the caloric restriction showed. But the second article that kind of comes alongside this one is comparison of weight loss among named diet programs in overweight and obese adults. So it's a meta-analysis. Thousands and thousands of participants were looked at. And when they looked at the results in the long term, it was interesting where there's this, how do I say this? There's this, especially when people come to fasting, there's this belief that you have to go low carb or you have to stay low carb forever. And I'm not talking about the ultra refined processed carbohydrates and the sugar and all of that stuff. What I'm talking about is this idea that like I'm never going to eat bread again, or ice cream's the devil, or it's not. And when you look at the research in diabetics too, which we've done episodes on, at the 12-month and then 18 and 24-month mark, it doesn't seem to be as sustainable. So this second article, looking at all these named diets, they were looking at no diet, the Learn diet. They were looking at moderate macronutrients, Atkins, low carb, low fat
zone.
And it was interesting because initially the low carb diet had the most amount of weight loss. So 8.73 kilograms at 6 months, but only then lost to 0.02 at 12 months.
Mm.
And then if you look at the moderate macronutrient, dun, 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 what we're talking about here, the 35-30-35 or the 40-40-20, that we see to really work for, a continuous fasting lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
It showed a great initial weight loss of 6.78 kilograms, so a couple kilograms less than the low carb,
Mm-hmm.
and at 6 months. And then at 12 months, it actually showed an additional weight loss. So
oh, nice.
There was significant weight loss at 6 months, and it was less at 12 months, but it was more sustainable because the low carb went to damn near nothing at 12 months.
Yeah.
Where the moderate macronutrient showed that there was still that sustainability piece at the 12-month mark, and then the low-fat group actually went backwards at 12 months.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
I used to use low fat, especially in the mid to late 90s when it was kind of, in vogue. But what's interesting to me also is the fact that when we go through the data as far as low carb and effectiveness of different macronutrient splits with respect to fat loss, we do see, like you mentioned, those diminishing returns as you go farther and farther out, which is why we've talked before about keto cycling, for example, and low carb.
Yeah, like a 90-day. Yep.
Yeah, where it can be very, very helpful. It can be like that's maximizing the therapeutic benefit right there, but then minimizing the chances of kind of that pent up demand for those carbohydrates and just that lack of sustainability. I mean, we all know people who tend to kind of live more of a low carb lifestyle,
Yep.
and so
I'm one of them.
Yeah, and so it can definitely work long term, but it's tough to kind of stick with it with that same level of vigilance for a long period of time. But here's the other thing: it's not necessarily what's needed to support good metabolic health and maintaining control of the scale and good muscle mass and a good amount of fat mass as well, or a low healthy amount of fat mass as well. So that can be the thing where we use it in a cyclical way, but then also work towards that more balanced approach over the longer term as well. And if more fat loss is warranted, then potentially doing another round or periodic cycling of those low carb approaches, because like you said, fasting is oftentimes kind of commingled with either low carb or keto. Like you'll often hear like keto and fasting, or low carb and fasting. And
hey, and guess what? That didn't work. That didn't work for me long term.
Sure. Yeah. And
intermittent fasting.
Keto is very calorically dense, and depending on what your needs are and your metabolic health and your gut microbiome, you're going to have a different response, and your metabolic flexibility, you're going to have a different response versus somebody else who's doing it as well. So it's not necessarily the holy grail that it's kind of painted as sometimes.
And it can work for some people. So if it's working for you, don't stop. Just add in some more consistent fasting. So when we're looking at, tell me, there's one other interesting thing about that, the comparison of weight loss among named diet programs that you found in regards to exercise. Yeah.
So what was interesting is that there was a behavioral support component and an exercise component within those different named diets that they actually wanted to determine if those had an actual effect outside of just the diet themselves. And so
one point of clarity here. All of these were much lower in protein and were non-fasting results.
Yeah, no fasting involved. Good points. And so,
however, big picture, beginning with the end in mind, what you're about to say is something that we practice and preach because we believe it's part of that becoming the 5% that keep the weight off, becoming the 12% that are metabolically healthy. So this component right here is really key to any sustainable program. We believe fasting is the easiest and most efficient way to get there. But yeah, this part was really cool.
Yeah. So what they found was that taking the behavioral support component, they found a beneficial effect to behavioral support within these named diets. And so there was greater weight loss at 6 months than there was prior to that with the behavioral support. and there was greater weight loss at 12 months as well, but with less of a benefit on the behavioral support component. So almost like, maybe somewhere in around the 6 month mark for a lot of folks, they had established a lot of the habits that they were still bringing with them, and so maybe they just weren't seeing a greater net benefit continuing with that behavioral support. So maybe diminishing returns might be how I might interpret that.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see the opposite of that on the exercise component, where there was a better net benefit to weight loss at 6 months, but that net benefit actually increased at the 12-month mark when exercise was part of their actual strategy, which is really cool because that's continuing to support metabolic health, metabolic rate, basal metabolic rate, and overall physiological function and hormonal function. At the later stages of their weight loss, and so there were a few cool differences that they found there. And one other thing I wanted to highlight about that study was the fact that when they kind of talk about the low carb versus low fat results and compared those groups, they're talking a lot about very similar weight loss between those groups. But I would press that they need to go a little bit deeper on those. And they probably didn't have the data to do this necessarily, but to actually look at the difference between fat mass loss and fat-free mass loss. If that was available, I'm going to hypothesize that there might have been a substantial difference between the low carb and the low fat group at 6 months and 12 months. So even though the scale may have stayed the same, if their protein intake was substantially different, which it would tend to be on a low carb versus a low fat diet, then their actual weight distribution may have been substantially different as well.
A couple of the takeaways I found interesting from the microbiome study with fasting versus caloric restriction. One, again, we're going to say it one more time. We love the fact that it was protein focused, right? That protein doesn't happen by accident. But interestingly, the IFP group decreased sugar intake and increased dietary fiber as well when compared to caloric restriction. Both of them showed improvements in GI symptoms, which was cool too. But I want to highlight a few overall big kind of impacts of the intermittent fasting. Then I want to get a little bit nerdy in terms of a couple of cool things that stood out for the energy utilization pathways and the metabolic pathways and the difference between the fasting and the caloric restriction group. But overall, for fasting for the win, when you are combining the protein with the fasting, so that 35% protein mark, and we can argue all day about the other two remaining macronutrients, where those numbers should be and how specific you have to be. And right, if you're not tracking, then don't track, but just start with protein and focus on that first, right?
You get protein right, the other two don't matter as much and tend to fall into place also.
Yep. So when we're looking at these two groups, so the IFP regimen significantly influenced gut microbiome dynamics compared to CR. So it suggests that IFP may lead to more favorable changes in microbial composition and function. When it comes to weight loss and body composition, the IFP group had a 3 kilogram greater weight loss than when compared to the calorie restriction group. Now, again, this is an obese and overweight group, so weight loss resistance, insulin resistance, hormonal response to carbohydrates and foods, right? So IFP participants lost more total, abdominal, and visceral fat mass.
Oh, excellent.
While increasing their fat-free mass percentage.
Oh, great.
So both resulted in significant reduction in total fat, carbohydrate, sodium, sugar, and energy intake by approximately 40% from baseline levels. However, the IFP group obviously had that greater focus on protein, so people actually, without being told, naturally increased their protein beyond that number.
Okay. Wow.
So automatically, like, the body started being like, yeah, kind of like all right, I'm kind of liking these changes. So they started
Sure.
shifting in that direction. IFP group reported a significant decrease in GI symptoms over time compared to the caloric restriction group.
Mm.
So improved gut health and reduced discomfort. So what the fluctuations when you're starting to fast and you're notice some gut changes and less bloating and more consistent bowel movements and
stomach acid production.
Yeah, a balancing of all that entire GI tract. So greater function. And it also says CR did not significantly influence microbial colonization. There were notable increases in certain variants, but this happened and more diversity was found in the IFP group. So we're going to have a more diverse, and if you ever heard of the gut-brain axis, that 80% of the immune system lives in your gut, you're going to have a more diverse microbiome, which is going to then have a whole cascade of effects on immune function, immune response, autoimmune issues, inflammatory responses, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
There's more. IFP was associated with an increase in metabolites. So metabolism, metabolomic profile. When we're looking at this new emerging area of research, it's looking at the breakdown of the metabolites and like the processing of the cellular metabolism, how the body actually processes or stores fat and energy. So IFP was associated with an increase in metabolites favoring, here's the kicker, fat oxidation. So fat burning.
Wow.
Now
versus carbohydrate sugar burning.
Correct. We talk about this fat adaptation, flipping the metabolic switch, ketone production, going from a sugar burner to a fat burner, right? Now, caloric restriction was linked to metabolites associated with longevity-related metabolic pathways, which I thought was cool. But when you're fasting, you are putting yourself into a caloric restriction. So I'm like, I think we're going to get the best of both worlds here.
Yeah, I love the longevity stuff with respect to some caloric restriction when fat loss and reduction of fat mass is not the main priority.
Right.
I love that. So so that means you can kind of continue those beneficial effects. But like you said, you can get the best of both worlds here with the intermittent fasting and protein pacing as well. So it's really cool to see that the grouping of metabolites that's found in the gut microbiome and which metabolic pathways it's pushing towards, either fat burning or carbohydrate burning. I mean, it makes intuitive sense, but it's really nice to see a study devoted to the gut microbiome and then what's actually going on within the biochemical cascades that happen after that. Because just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's necessarily what's happening in real time.
What I just heard you say there is that a mechanism doesn't always result in a certain outcome.
Sure. Yeah. And just because it seems logical doesn't necessarily mean that's what we find in vivo when we actually go into a living organism to see what's happening.
So we actually looked at the different energy utilization pathways and how the impact of the IFP group kind of impacted those from a mechanistic standpoint. So there was enhanced amino acid metabolism. So that's giving protection against increased longevity metrics, protection against oxidative stress, and increased use of amino acids for energy, which I thought was cool. Then there was the fat oxidation, which I already mentioned, increased circulating cytokines linked to lipolysis and fat oxidation. So this is, for me, when I read that, this is the switch from glucose glycogen to ketone production.
Yep.
We're oxidizing the fat. We're getting more into fat burning and shutting off insulin and shutting off blood sugar and short-term energy supplies so we can go burn more fat. And then there was a change in the metabolic pathways in regards to the flexibility component. So it increased metabolic flexibility with fasting and protein. So this is the efficient nature or the level of efficiency for your body to switch between carbs and fats for energy depending on availability. So now I can go have a pizza night with the kids and I don't get that slump after. Because my body is able to flip from me being more in a low carb, more carnivore, more ketone, consistent fasting regimen state where when I now have carbs, I have that metabolic flexibility to be able to handle them better. So this flexibility is crucial for that like balance and like life balance, kind of supporting long-term weight loss, kind of like live your life, like figure out how to make this work for you kind of concept.
Right.
And then the last one that really stuck out to me was the cytokine profile. So with IFP, it was linked to decreased inflammation and a balanced immune response, which is directly related to that metabolic process for your body to use or store energy. So just overall, like a whole host of just incredible, like granular things that you're going to get from fasting and protein pacing.
That's amazing. I have not seen this data pulled out of any human or other or animal studies either. So this is really cool. And speaking of the example of like mood and patience and things like that, like being mentally prepared, right? That you kind of associate with fasting and just feeling better and those energy levels. It was interesting because one thing that they said specifically in this study was notably in the calorie restriction group, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan biosynthesis which are important for neurotransmitter production, were reported to be suppressed in those with obesity specifically. And so that's really interesting because those chemical substrates are not only important for neurotransmitters, but also for the emotional response and the actual mood development within the brain. So if you have poor amino acid synthesis, especially for some of these specific amino acids, you're not going to be able to elevate your mood in the way that you would whenever these things are just more abundant. And so when we talk about, kind of enjoying the process, or like, how do you feel during the process? If the main goal is fat loss, for example, even if the caloric restriction had a similar effect, if you have a decrease in these neurotransmitters, well, that means your neurological system is working less efficiently, and then your brain is not able to regulate emotional control and mood as well. And so, I mean, that's a big difference in how you might feel when you find yourself either calorically restricting versus strategically fasting and protein pacing. And that may or may not be directly related to your example, Scott, what you just said. But I mean, for me, if I needed to pick one of those groups, I want to put myself in the one that means I can enjoy the process more often and for longer. I mean, you can extrapolate that over time and go to sustainability and long-term lifestyle change, and which one's going to be more likely to be a success.
For me, it's looking at the sustainability component, right? So when we're looking at the fact that we're going to see these benefits, right, in the gut microbiome, we're going to see this. We talked about the named diets and how the exercise was a component for sustained weight loss, and looking at the different macronutrients and all of this stuff. That's all great, right? But the reality is when you feel bad and then the food opportunity or the fasting window closure or opening or sticking to the plan comes up, when you don't feel good or feel like your emotions in that moment, you're going to be less likely to do the thing that that's going to result in you hitting your goals, staying consistent, and reaching your long-term,
exactly,
like we say, big, hairy, audacious goal.
Yep.
So this is why we love the flexibility of fasting. If you're looking for more support, join a challenge. Go grab the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss. Take our fasting persona quiz that's in the show notes. Just get some perspective on where you're at in your journey. And ultimately, then you just want to pick one or two things. For my big takeaway from this episode is that fasting gives you this flexibility to be able to kind of get repetitions and play around with different applications in your day-to-day life. So it really, for us, is always begin with the end in mind. And if you're going to be able to protein pace and fast consistently, you're going to notice that fasting changes those food decisions. It changes how you feel on a day-to-day basis. And ultimately, that's going to result in long-term sustainability and you shifting your thoughts and how you feel about the whole weight loss dieting world, right? Everybody out there knows, and the stats show 74% of the population is overweight. Well, we know that we should all be at a healthy weight or trying to obtain that in terms of long-term health and longevity. But why do people not do it? Well, it's because they don't feel like it.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Or their environment isn't supportive of that a lot of the time. So they fall back into those old habits. And that's why we do the challenges. That's why we have coaching. That's why we have the resources to give you that a little bit of perspective shift so you can make this work for you, Tommy. So as we wrap up today, final thoughts to put a bow on this conversation, some really cool takeaways, really cool science that I had never even seen before when it comes to the metabolites in the gut and how fasting and protein. I had never seen this. This came out in 2023. So just really cool research. And I really love where this is going.
Yeah, so do I. I think final takeaway for me would be to look at your next nutrition opportunity. The next time you go to break your fast, look at that as a real opportunity to make some improvements in your gut microbiome that then lead to the metabolic pathways that are the ones that you want to drive forward to reduce that visceral fat, reduce that overall fat mass, and increase your amino acid and protein synthesis, and then into the lipolysis pathway, the fat burning pathway, and ketosis as well. So look at that as an opportunity, not so that you have to micromanage your macronutrients so much, but just starting with protein pacing, and then feel the effect on your next fast as well. Kind of note that, write it down, maybe journal about it for a minute, and see how that works, because a little bit of consistency right there starts to lead to a cascade of improvements in your gut microbiome that are likely to pay you dividends over the coming days and weeks and even into the months and throughout the year as well.
Yeah, I love it. So really cool stuff, really cool research, tons of benefits, kind of reaffirms what we see anecdotally from a macronutrient standpoint, from a fasting standpoint, from an extended fasting standpoint, from how often should you be doing those. So if you're looking for more guidance, reach out, head to the show notes, grab a resource, join the next challenge. Tommy, as always, I appreciate the conversation, sir. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye. So you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life. While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.